Y
No necesito transmitir la presentación a Zoom, ¿no? Ok, ya componerla. Listo.
pero nosotros manejamos el PowerPoint.
El PowerPoint. Listo.
Mejor.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Vamos a comenzar la sesión número 3. Good morning. Thank you very much for all being here. This is the third session of Keynes, Kalecki, and inflation targeting. Today, we have the honor to receive 3 leading experts on many, many topics, but related especially with finance, development, and post-Keynesian economics. This session will be, we will start with the presentations from the keynote speakers. Then we will give 15 minutes to each one, and then we will have a session of questions or comments. I will start introducing our first presenter, Jan Toborowski. He's an economics and finance professor at SOAS in the University of London. You already know him from the previous 2 very enlightening and insightful presentations on Thursday and Friday. Then after Professor Jan Toborowski, we'll continue with Professor Malcolm Sawyer. He's an emeritus professor of the University of Leeds. He's also a leading expert on Kalecki, on post-Keynesian economics, on monetary policy, and many, many other topics. Thank you very much for being here. And last but not least, Professor Noemi Levy, full professor of the Faculty of Economics at UNAM. She's expert on finance development, economic structure, and you know her pretty well. So, Professor Toporowski, we will start. We can start. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you very much for the organizers of this series of lectures, and in particular this panel. Let me start off, go straight into what I have to say. It's relatively simple. I really want to report 2 articles, 2 papers that from the London newspaper Financial Times on capital market operations, articles which actually show what capital markets actually do, as opposed to what the textbooks, what the economics textbooks say that they do. In an article, there was a front page article in the Financial Times on the 28th of December, 2024, by Harriet Klarfeld. The headline was "Corporate Debt Sales Hit 8 Trillion Record." What the article said was global issuance of corporate bonds and leveraged loans climbed more than a third from 2023 to $7.93 trillion. Bankers say that cheap funding costs initially persuaded companies to pull forward issuance of the new stock to avoid any turbulence around the US elections. So last year, corporations were issuing more bonds because they were concerned about the possibility that the stock markets would be turbulent around the election. But in fact, after Trump won the election, the stock market went even higher. The borrowing costs, in other words, the market yield on new bonds, fell even smaller, fell, and corporations decided to bring forward the next year's 2025 borrowing. Why? why did they do this? Initially, it was just to de-risk funding for the year. In other words, make the funding less risky. Then the motivation changed. Actually, conditions look pretty attractive. Why don't we just pull forward funding for 2025 as well? So plans to issue securities bonds in 2025 were brought into 2024. And even after the 2024 issuance bonanza, many bankers said they expected a steady stream of borrowing next year as companies refinance the wave of cheap debt that they had secured during the pandemic. And then what were the prospects for this? Well, activity will remain steady, but the wild card, the possible danger, the potential for more significant large-scale debt-financed mergers and acquisitions put forward by an economist or banker from JP Morgan, that if you have too much debt-financed mergers and acquisitions, then this is dangerous for companies. Let me move on to what were the key concepts in this. First of all, the term funding. Funding is the issue of long-term stock or debt to repay short-term borrowing, bank borrowing, or to add to reserves. De-risking is the building up of reserves. Adding to reserves makes balance sheets less risky because it makes a company more liquid. This is what Minsky or Kriegel in the United States refer to as cushions of safety. They reduce the drain on cash flow of short-term debt, and they fix interest costs. The reduced drain on cash flow of short-term debt simply means that you don't have to, if you borrow short-term, you don't have to keep rolling it over. If you issue a 10-year bond, you have the money for 10 years, worry in 10 years' time about repaying it. Refinancing. Capital market issues are nearly all to refinance existing borrowing. And here I refer to a phrase that I used in a paper that I wrote many years ago. I've forgotten where it came from, but somewhere there it says, in an era of finance mostly finances finance. The money from financial operations goes into making financial operations even bigger. The overissue or bringing forward of future stock issues gives companies extra liquidity, further de-risking. Okay, mergers and acquisitions. These are crucial because debt-financed mergers and acquisitions bring liquidity into the capital market at the expense of debt on corporate balance sheets. What do I mean by that? They bring liquidity into the capital market? If there is, if one corporation borrows money to buy another corporation, then the shareholders of the target company that is being bought, the shareholders receive a bank deposit. If they're lucky, they receive a bank deposit, which is liquid, and they will normally use this to buy other securities. So this debt finance mergers and acquisitions are a way of injecting additional government borrowing, not government, additional corporate borrowing into the capital market. It's very similar with private equity buyouts. So let me move to my conclusions. Functions of capital markets, the holding, the issuers of stocks are holding companies. Let's be clear, they're not individual companies. This is a very important distinction, because the holding company, the company which holds controls a number of subsidiary companies. This is a very effective way of controlling ownership, but also bringing additional capital, it's a way of bringing additional capital into the company without losing control of the company, without the key shareholders losing control. So holding company issuers of stocks, they don't use the money from issuing stock for capital investment, but simply for managing risk, liquidity, and debt. This is the key function of issuing those stocks. The issuing such stocks transfers liquidity out of the capital market into an internal allocation of liquidity within the corporation, within the holding company. This is very important, because if you understand that most private sector investment is done by by the subsidiary companies, holding companies, their financing costs are not determined in the capital market, but they're determined administratively inside the holding company. More significantly, large-scale debt-financed mergers and acquisitions, actually in the US, they had fallen by over 30% from January 2024 to January 2025 to the lowest level since 2015. Now that's an interesting point. Why? Because it shows that what was happening in in the issuing of stocks by companies, this big bonanza of issuing corporate bonds was not, in fact, it turned out didn't finance mergers and acquisitions, but was building up reserves. And it's part of the explanation why corporations in the United States and multinational corporations are so liquid, are very, very liquid today. And because of that, low risk and very stable. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Professor Toporowski, a great use of time and very clear presentation. Now we continue with Professor Malcolm Sawyer.
Well, thank you very much and for inviting me here, and it's a great pleasure. Yeah. I say it's a great pleasure to be able to come back to Mexico City. It's been far too long since I was here. I think it's now 12 years ago. So I'm very delighted to be here talking at this conference. I'm going to make some general remarks about financialization and the effects of financialization. In 15 minutes, obviously, I can't go into very much detail. Can you move the slide on? Good. What is meant by financialization has been very much a contested topic. Different people mean it in different ways. And I just really want to look at it in terms of this general growth in importance of the financial sector and the financial motives and so forth. But along with that is to the changes in the way in which the financial system operates, the way it relates to corporations and corporations relate to it. Some of the ways, in some sense, Jan was hinting at. So I like the definition, or at least a working, the scope of financialization, which Jerry Epstein put forward now some 20 years ago, this increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. So by financial motives, I would take that the way we much more calculate, are there going to be financial returns to us? Is this going to be profitable? Rather than saying, are we going to do a good job here? We're going to say, is this going to be a profitable job to do? And that permeates the way things operate in many ways. Financial markets have clearly grown, but not only grown, but they've changed in the ways in which they operate. They become much more complex, develop all sorts of new products and new motivations. And then the involvement of financial institutions in the way in which companies and others operate. And I think we also need to extend this definition to include the increasing role of finance in the general workings of society and policies and polities. So we know that we, as individuals, we're much more involved in the financial system, but we also know the financial system is much more involved in the operation of our political system and payment to political parties and such like. Now, other authors on financialization have given it a rather, in some sense, a broader scope than Epstein did, or perhaps in some ways elaborate on some of the ways in which these financial motives and the financial institutions vary. So Van der Zwaan, again, about 10 years ago now, identified 3 broad approaches which can be useful ways of summarizing the range of perspectives on financialization. The first, which I'm not going to say much about, is the financialization as a regime of accumulation. It's a new regime of accumulation that's developed over the last 40 or 50 years, and it represents a distinct stage of capitalism. The second idea, is that moving on? Yeah. Right. The second idea is what is called the financialization of the modern corporation. And in many respects, I think this has had almost, I'm not sure how one measures this, but the much greater impact, perhaps, than some of the other aspects. So the financialization of the modern corporation is partly a matter of now kind of who owns a modern corporation. Is it financial institutions, directly or indirectly? And what motivations are they putting onto the corporation? And many have argued that this has been related with the development of the pursuit of shareholder value. Whereas at one time, a number of us used to teach and argue that modern corporations were interested in size and growth. And this is, there's always debates about how far that went. But this is an argument that modern corporations have become much more involved and pushed, as it were, in the direction of the pursuit of shareholder value. That the shareholders are now often large financial corporations, and they can push, as it were, the corporations into operating that. But I think a particular aspect of this is, what does this mean in terms of the pursuit of shareholder value mean for what corporations actually do? And when we used to argue that maybe corporations were operated by managers and operated in the interests of growth, then it was because they were rewards from growth and so forth, that this was pushing in the direction of growth. Now, in some sense, paradoxically, the pursuit of shareholder value has come to be, well, they take much more short-term decisions to reap dividends and profits, and pay less attention to, for example, investing in research and development. They may place less emphasis on even undertaking investment if that comes at the risk in the short term of lower dividends and so forth. But it also pushes companies in the direction, again, of paying much more attention to profits, and of course, much more attention to profits rather than wages. So this pursuit of shareholder value can have implications, for example, of the distribution of income between wages and profits. And these sort of aspects permeate through society. So this idea that the pursuit of shareholder value may, as it were, paradoxically be perhaps detrimental to the development of the economy in terms of scaling back on research and development, or the direction of research and development, and on investment and so forth. And I think this is also significant in the way in which countries are now wanting to pursue growth, and to do so through the development of the financial sector. And this may be that actually it's not going to help very much if the pursuit of shareholder value is going on there. The third part is the financialization of the everyday life, and this is reflected in numerous ways, ranging from the greater involvement of people with the financial sector, whether through having bank accounts, credit cards, entering into debt, and so forth. But perhaps more significantly is the incursion of the financial sector into pension funds, but also into the operation of many parts of, for example, housing or of social care. So the extent to which financial institutions have in effect taken over, for example, many aspects of social care, and run those on the grounds of profitability rather than on the grounds of providing good social care to people, or to take over the management of social care, not to bear in mind to provide better social care, but because by owning property, you can, as it were, speculate on or pay attention, as it were, to what's happening to property values, and be much more concerned with the property values rather than with the provision of social care. Now, I want to then briefly turn to some of the possible effects of this financialization, and these debates go back now several years. Now, there's always been, I suppose, a strain of argument that, at least insofar as financialization involves the growth of the financial sector, the growth of the banking sector, then this would be positively associated with economic growth. The argument was that the growth of the banking sector would, as well, encourage savings, because there now be a way of keeping your savings in financial instruments, that the financial institutions would allocate funds to investment and would monitor those funds and make decisions about where those funds were going to be allocated. So by stimulating saving and by monitoring the use of those savings, the funds which are generated by it, it would raise growth. And perhaps the most conventional wisdom, at least in 20 years ago, is summarized in the quote which is up on the screen by Levine, in terms of this relationship between the size of the financial sector and what was often called financial development and growth, or what's sometimes called economic development. There was always a question about the direction of causation. Did the financial sector become larger as a result of growth, or did growth come as a result of the growth of the financial sector? So which way the causation ran was always a question. But this was very much related to the growth rate of the banking sector, because that was the main way in which people could hold their financial assets, and the way in which those funds were allocated. Obviously not entirely, but that was a main one. Now, I think much of the empirical work since probably the last 20, 25 years now has really found that, if anything, the growth of the financial sector is not positively related to economic growth, or at least over some range, financial development may enable growth, but after some stage, that peters out. And I put on the on the screen there, two quotes in terms of some bits of pieces of evidence that people have produced about this. So that just to make some perhaps remarks about why this might have changed. One line of argument is that the lending activities of the financial sector have shifted from lending to firms for investment purposes towards lending for households, mortgages, consumer credit, and so forth, which in that sense has less growth potential. Consumer credit may help to boost spending in the short term, but does not directly aid investment. And we could also say, to some degree, that if the financial sector is lending to other parts of the financial sector, again, it looks to be that the financial sector is growing, but is lending to itself, and so that's not going to affect very much investment. Second, financial fragility and instability, which comes with the growth of the financial sector, they may come along with higher rates of financial deepening, and the financial fragility increases the risks of financial crisis. And financial crises have typically had quite major effects upon the growth in particular economies for perhaps rather obvious reasons. Third, the resources which are deployed in the financial sector, which could have otherwise been deployed in the real sector, in the rest of the economy. And it is the case that financial sector employs often highly skilled labor, which is thereby not available for employment in the real sector of the economy. But sometimes people have put it, financial engineering replaces physical engineering, and physical engineering, building bridges, roads, whatever, may be rather more helpful for financial development, for economic development than financial engineering. Fourth, much of the growth of the financial sector has been in the extensive trading of financial assets, with the growth of things like securitization and derivatives, which do not in themselves facilitate savings and investment. And we know in other areas that there's a great deal of trading, for example, in currencies, which is greatly in excess of what is required to finance trade and long-term investment. Just to wrap up here, as I'm coming to by the end of my 15 minutes, I just summarize this idea that this pursuit of shareholder value has been viewed as having a range of possible and other adverse effects on the other stakeholders and on the real economy more generally. The focus of attention has been on the pressures on managers to pursue short-term profits, even at the expense of investment and indeed longer-term profits. I was looking at some figures the other day, and one of the, again, almost paradoxical features is that during this period of the pursuit of shareholder value, there's been a general decline in the rate of profit across many countries. Oh, and I'm sorry, my last slide, at least in English, is a repeat of the previous one. So I finished there. Thank you very much.
Voy a decir unas palabras en español, una disculpa, voy a hablar en inglés, espero que se entienda, pero van a estar la presentación en español. Well, I'll be speaking on capital markets, finance, and monetary policy in emerging economies. So the presentations of Jan Toporowski and Malcolm Sawyer will be extremely helpful for what I want to say today. The first thing I want to note is that capital markets has been on in Latin America at least since the 18th century. However, they developed in the 1990s without attaining a complete development and with unsuccessful experiences in the 1970s as financial groups. It didn't operate. My discussion, what happened with financial market will be made at two levels. First, general concepts, And then I will analyze what's going on in Mexico specifically. In Mexico, I want to show the importance of having an export-driven model and the importance of multilateral and multilatins in terms of how they developed and their peculiarity in terms of developed economies. And then I will say something about monetary policy and finance and risk management process in our economies. The first concept, holdings. I think Jan Toporowski has made it very clear that corporates do not access liquidity in capital markets to finance themselves, but rather to have liquidity or to organize liquidity between their subsidiaries. He called it as a non-official capital market. What are the source of fundings for this corporation? We start off with the idea that investment self-finances, past profits, rentier capital, and they require the liquidity instead of investment. Which are the key elements? First, external finance is not linked to investment, but rather to funding and risk management. Liquidity access depends on the corporate capital volume. Therefore, you have different growth rates of big and small firms, and also different rates between developed and developing economies. These, I think, are two important facts. After Malcolm's presentation on financialization, I don't think I have to say much. Only I will argue that I will stress that financial banks increase their participation in all social groups, workers, corporation, government, and you name it. And as financial market deepens and become more complex, they can induce financial cycles, financial gain and losses. And corporation, as Malcolm said it at the end, objectives is just to increase, well, it's mostly to increase their financial value. And in this sense, they're looking for increasing financial gains, which doesn't mean that profits in the productive sector increases, it's just on the circulation. Something about centralization and concentration regarding to financialization. We know that large corporations expand to dominate and control new markets and activities, accessing to increased liquidity. Expansion is based on increased borrowing, higher gearing ratios, and induces financial cycles. These activities need to be backed by higher financial prices. Financial inflation or deflation here is an important issue for financialization to continue. I want to remind that corporations, because I want to link it with crisis, that large corporations began back in the 17th century, I think, in England, by the separation between ownership and management. And in the first globalization or finalization period, they expanded through the deepening of the capital market. I think this has been studied different ways. Lenin, Hilferding, Rosa Luxemburg has a different view, which is quite interesting, especially for developing countries. This type of institution led to big crises. And we can recall the 1929 financial crisis happened in the US, a capital market boom in the real estate sector, followed by financial depression, economic recession that led to a global trade standstill. In this period, our country started to industrialize. because of the 1929 crash. At that time, there was no loose monetary policy to repay debts. Therefore, the crisis was very deep. The 2008 financial crisis again occurred in the US, again in the real estate sector, the difference being that a loose monetary policy followed it, which neutralized financial crisis without recovering growth. Took about 10 years to come to where they were before the crisis. The 2008 crisis took place in a global interconnected economy, both in terms of production, global change, global supply chains, and finance, globalization. The loose monetary policy of the US increased liquidities in our countries, which helped the recession of 2010 to overcome in a couple of months, and production continued. So there wasn't this global standstill like it was after 1929. Then I want to move to monetary policy with complex capital market, which is important for us. Traditional monetary policy instruments we know became weaker. Interest rate movements, open market cooperation, and credit cost availability had little impact of big investment or in large corporation. They don't have problems of any exchange rate movement or even exchange rate movements inside big corporations. But it affected very much small and medium firms. My first four conclusions are: financial markets reflect the strengths or weakness of a country's productive structure, and their operation determines financial and productive cycles. Second, financial markets provide liquidity, not finance. Financial markets exacerbate both capital centralization and concentration. And the different growth rate between big and small, developed and underdeveloped economy. Monetary policy has limited effects in large corporations since they have all these treasury debentures operating. Let's go very quickly to my second and for me more interesting part, which what's happened in developing countries. We know that in our countries, economic activities have shifted to the external sector in exports, production, and foreign investment. Multinational corporations dominate leading dynamic productive sectors and exports. Multilatinal, which is our type of corporations, expand to access international financial centers and operates in non-dynamic centers, highly disconnected from their parent company. So you have the multilatinals, not much to do with our countries, but multinationals very related to the home parent company. I think this is an important issue. Therefore, exports became the primary driver of economic activity, leaving behind investment. Financial accounts, it's much, much higher than the current account, and actually foreign investment in this sense provide liquidity to our economies. For us, it's an important issue, monetary policy and exchange rate. Monetary policy, which in our countries usually higher interest rates relative to developing country to stabilize the exchange rate. Domestic market are more, in domestic market, liquidity is much more expanding, affecting funding and risk management instruments in domestic currency. So private sector resorts to the external market in this sense. The other thing is that the foreign exchange market is extremely big in our economies, and actually the Mexican peso is the emerging currency most traded currency, and it's not done between Mexican counterparts, or the debts are not settled in Mexico, usually in offshore companies. So there is little things that the government or the monetary policy can do to it. What are the distortions in developing economy? Multinational operate as productive enclaves, with limited integration with domestic productive and financial structure and strong dependence with their parent companies. So, look at the automotive, the car industry. This is a typical example. Economic growth is slow, and productivity, even in complex manufacture sector, is extremely low due to reliance on cheap labor. So we have a unique situation, a very complex export production in Mexico with no investment and very low productivity, and based on cheap labor. They don't operate either in the domestic financial market. Multilatinate expand to access international financial sector, while they only registered in local markets to carry their operation in the international centers. The productive link between the parent company and subsidiary are extremely weak, and a major issue is that foreign investment create excess liquidity, and finance remains very scarce in our economies because the demand for finance is very small. A small and medium enterprise face high difficulties in the financial cost, and they have not much liquidity. What the Mexican economy requires, this is my next and last question, the developing of funding mechanism and risk management need to be done in local currency. I think if you start to link more of the multinationals and the multilatinals with the domestic country in terms of finance and in terms of production, economic growth can be increased. I only want to finish saying that historically, Mexico has lacked private sector funding instruments and risk management mechanisms. There always have been in foreign currency. In the substitution industrialization era, funding was done by the public sector through trust funds, while external debt was managed by development banks. The costs associated with interest and fluctuation exchange rate adjustment were absorbed by the public sector. Liquidity withdrawal took place to legal reserve requirements, never used the tax instruments to withdraw liquidity from the economy. And this had big effects on profit, which not having domestic entrepreneurs being innovative because they just have high profit with not risking capital. The effects of globalization is a shift to international currency denominated funding, and necessitated the implementation of high rate of interest rate and counter-cycle fiscal and monetary policies to maintain economic stability. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, especially as a moderator. I appreciate you have stick to the time. You actually finished perfectly on time, even though we had less time. So thank you very much. More time for question and answer. And definitely there's many challenges that all three presentations have put forth. However, I have a question more on the perspective quite broad and trying to knit together the three of the presentations. My first question is it realistic to kind of target a definancialization, or are we in an era where we just can tame finance? It would be great to have some comments from you on how would taking from Wall Street or Lombard Street to finance to Main Street, it would be implemented. And second question, more related um, with developing economies. Um, Capital flights are a big threat for policies, and do you have any comments on that? How could that be uh, changed? How can developing economies can increase their autonomy and make finance work for development? Um, These are very broad questions that can be answered from each one of them. I will ask if there are some questions. If I were you, I would just take this chance. This is a big chance to ask to three leading experts on finance and development and some other interesting topics. So please raise your hand. We have one, two, and if there's another one, we can close this session of questions and start an. There's not another one right now. Okay. We start with Santiago, then we go with Alberto. I don't know. What is the one?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions, maybe with a complex answer. The first one is about liquidity. What is liquidity? The concept of liquidity, because we in the presentation you didn't mention the role of the central bank to provide liquidity. So maybe the concept of liquidity can be related with the way or with the cost to transform an asset to monetary base, but that is too simple, and I think that the concept of liquidity it's related to an institutional framework. And the other question to Professor Sawyer is that in some moment in the 19th century, the country that developed its financial sector was the country that dominated the world through the Central Bank of England and with the Lombard, with the Bayot principle to stabilize their financial country, the financial system. So there is a possibility to, through regulation, to use the financial sector to impulse the growth rate of the economy. And the last one to Professor Levy, I think that in Mexico we have a financial constrained growth. That is that the financial sector put the constraint to the economy to growth. What maybe the thing that we have to develop is an institutional framework to control capital, to try to develop a national policy to industrialize our economy and to accelerate our rate of growth. Thank you.
Okay. All right. No, está bien. Gracias. Well, first of all, thanks a lot, the three of you, four, Manuel, also. I believe the three presentations have a very complementary topic of resonance between all among us. Huh? And first of all, I want to ask for the three of you that in these presentations, we've been recognizing a lot of stuff like the distributional effects between capitalist classes also the effects of distribution between capitalists and workers, and in a very complex capitalist economy with complex financial relationships. But the question that I want to ask today is, in all this sense that we've been talking about, how do you think that the distributional effect occurs between capitalists and workers in developing countries such as Mexico, no? And what role exchange rate plays in this whole dynamic? That's it. Thank you.
Yes, um, so go, let me start off with the uh, last question on the distributional effects of the exchange rate in developing countries. Yes, the exchange rate does have distributional effects, but I think it depends very much on the structure of the economy, in the sense that if you look at the if you say that the both capitalists and workers earn in domestic currency, let's just suppose, and then, or maybe the capitalists may have assets abroad, but what happens with a devaluation is that with the change in the exchange rate, a devaluation quite clearly improves the income of the wealthy if they have assets, if they have foreign currency or they have foreign assets. On the other hand, it tends to make it raises the cost of imports. So the wealthy who buy more imports than poorer people, they will be badly affected. On the whole, I think the exchange rate, the effects of a devaluation is really, or the changes in the exchange rate, their main effect is to change the size of the domestic market relative to the foreign market. And Kalecki certainly had this view that devaluation doesn't work because benefits for the export market are diminished by the disadvantages for the domestic market, which now has to pay more for imported goods. So the one tends to cancel out the other. So that's on the distributional effects. What is liquidity? Yes, this is a very interesting point, because liquidity is not the same thing as money. Liquidity is not does not circulate. Is not money that goes in general circulation, because you cannot go and buy a coffee with and pay for it with a treasury bill. The liquidity is something that are the financial assets that may be used as means of payments, if you like, within the capitalist class or within the financial markets and between businesses. They affect, in particular, broader definitions of money. Is it the effect of what policy is good for development? This is a huge question, but I think you have to look at certainly the state has to take a leading role, but you simply have to look at the needs of society and the needs of economic activity, and that means economic and social targeting economic and social infrastructure. I could certainly be more specific about the financing of this, but the actual what should be done, I think is more difficult to say. The relationship of Wall Street to Main Street and targeting inflation. There's a lot of things like inflation targeting are really very much a part of a narrative of, why does inflation matter? Actually, yes, inflation matters because it has distributional effects, but critically, it has a critical importance for in the financial markets. Monetary policy has critical importance in the financial markets, and it's different to what it is in the real economy. Yeah, I think yes, that's my questions. Malcolm.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to make some perhaps fairly general comments and hope that they relate to the questions. Some of the questions, not all of them. One point to make first is that although I talked about financialization, in some respects, I'd like to call it the financialization of the second era of financialization, which we've observed, because of course there was a first era of financialization, late 19th century into the 20th century, for culminating in the great crash of 1929 and the banking crisis thereafter. I mean, it had some of the same features as the recent financialization because it differed in other important respects. So in that sense, financialization is not new, but the forms it has taken and its extent has been much greater. I think one of the questions that came up was, is there anything we can do, as it were, about the financial sector? Is there any way of changing the system? And I think it's in some senses fairly utopian to argue there are, given the power of the financial sector. But I suppose after the great financial crisis, we did have some thoughts that we might be able to, or that they could be better regulated, or and come back on the extremes of that. Some of that has perhaps not been entirely to our satisfaction. But I think we know the problems that arise because it is what many would call regulatory capture. I mean, we've seen the difficulties of changing regulation or regulating. Now, this comes, I say, much to the fore in the UK at the moment, where we have a whole series of industries, not financial, the other industries such as water, gas and electricity, which have been regulated, and they've really made a great mess of it. So we know that the problems of trying to change it is extremely difficult because of this regulatory capture. So we know there are those sort of problems, but the one line is possibly better regulation. But I think the other sorts are things like, is it possible to develop almost like an alternative financial sector, which is greater responsive to our needs, as it were? So, for example, what about the development of public banks? Which is quite a movement, I think, now in the US. What is the role of the development of more cooperative mutual banking, of which in the past we've had quite a significant amount? Again, from the UK, all of our mortgage finance was through cooperative mutual organizations, and that was basically to a large extent destroyed by the Thatcher government. But the possibilities of that, I think they all face significant difficulties, but is that a route to go down? Some other areas, which again often come up, what is the role of taxation in the financial transaction taxes and so on? Is that a way of reducing the scale of their operations? I think one other area I would say is how can we, what is the role for developing public provision or social provision outside of the scope of the financial sector? Now, what I mean by that is, for example, can healthcare be largely publicly provided? Can social care be largely publicly provided and funded so that it gets away from the role of the financial sector and the operation of private equity? And so the last part is of course the urgent need to ensure that the financial sector is supportive of addressing climate change, and at the moment the way things are going seems to be in the opposite direction to that. There was some thoughts that this might come about, but I think the most recent trends is that we can't put out much hope there. And so I think this makes almost like a much greater urgency to develop these alternative forms of banking, or to grow them much more than we've had the other two. But we all know the great obstacles that that's going to come up against.
Gracias. Voy a seguir en inglés, perdón. I want to follow with what Malcolm said. The only way to stop financial, well, to reduce financialization is to strengthen the productive sector. And here, public policy has a lot to do with it. Public services, putting up key industry, and finding new sectors to detonate economic growth. This is another one. I think financialization as it is today is getting in crisis by its own factors. Today, what happens with Trump and everything, it's part of the global crisis that we have today. The second question about capital flight, do we have problems with liquidity? I think in Latin America, we had an excess of liquidity in these last 20 years. The problem that there hasn't been any demand. And we know that international reserve have been climbing and climbing because all the international currency that comes in doesn't go through the productive sector. So I don't see this as a problem. And then I will go immediately to Santiago's question. Thank you. In Mexico, we are having for at least 25 years negative net internal credit. What does it mean? The central bank doesn't need to provide liquidity because it gets a lot of liquidity that comes from abroad that you have to change into domestic currency in order to enter, that there's liquidity to enter. So what's liquidity? There are debts or instruments, whatever I would say capitalists decide that they need to use to buy or settle debts. And I think if we believe in the Keynesian view that investment finance itself, there is no much problem if you require domestic resources. Another story, which we will be following from tomorrow onwards, is what happens with our economies that depend so much from the foreign market. So I don't think there are lots of financial constraints today. I think the problem is in the productive sector. And the exchange rate, just want to follow what Jan Toporowski says. For us to undervalue the exchange rate doesn't make any difference between imports and exports. The reason why is our productive sector is so weak that it doesn't respond. We go back to ECLAC's unequal terms of trade, which Kalecki always put forward in another way, that this is not, whenever we devalue, what we do is we increase inflation. As we increase inflation, we reduce the real wage. However, we have to be careful not to overvalue too much. So there, it is a monetary variable which has a productive background that it has to move. Thus, in this sense, Policy, I know in this faculty, everyone, there are some people that cry out, let's devalue, close the market, close the financial sector. Can we survive like that in this world? I don't think so. We have to find new ways of increasing investment, increasing income with income inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have time for two questions if there are on the table, or we can call it a day. If there is none, thank you very much for all you being here. Also, people that is following online. It was incredible, and there was a lot of food for thought on these 3 days. Yeah, personally, I feel really grateful to be here. And yeah, just to close this 3 days event, Professor Noemi Levy will say some final words.
I will start in Spanish and then I will switch to English. En primer lugar, le quiero agradecer a todo el equipo de trabajo del proyecto y los profesores que nos han acompañado. Realmente las 3 veces nos hemos tenido que mover del aula magna para acá. Eso significa que hay un interés por un pensamiento distinto. Me congratulo estar en esta universidad que acepte todas estas ideas. Quiero agradecer a su vez al Young Scholar Initiative, a Manuel Velasco, perdón, de nuevo, Manuel Valencia y Julia Juárez por el apoyo que nos dieron para realizar este evento. Creo que ellos están aquí también. Nosotros ya no podemos integrar esa organización por problemas de edad, pero ustedes sí pueden, entonces acérquense. No puedo dejar de mencionar la administración. Nos han apoyado desde la dirección, un agradecimiento especial al servicio de cómputo que ha estado pendiente de todos los problemas que hemos tenido. Agradezco en este sentido a la directora Lorena Rodríguez y al secretario general que también ha apoyado tremendamente. I want to finish this thanking our guests, Jan Toporowski and Malcolm Sawyer, for coming and discussing for us things that perhaps are not so clear for us, and engaging in an important discussion, which is important today, especially in Mexico, in terms where to go. We don't know what will happen in April, but we know that things cannot continue like this. Yeah. Yes, we need a trade agreement, but not this trade agreement. We need a different monetary policy. We need industrial policies. We need to increase income. This is a challenge, and we need to discuss how to continue with it. Thank you very much for the discussion that you have opened, and thanks to you that have been here the 3 days. Gracias. Terminamos. No, gracias a ti.